you know, beyond just eating organic food and whole food and taking a good quality multivitamin, there's some other things that we can do. So it's not just what you add, but it's also some things that you take away. So these are what we would call things that men don't need in their diets or in their lifestyles, right? So they don't, one of the things is man-stealing chemicals. What do I mean by man-stealing chemicals? Well, this is why I said earlier, organic food becomes more important. A lot of people have a hard time justifying the cost of organic food, but I'm of the opinion that one of the biggest reasons why, let's just take a diversion here, one of the biggest reasons why we see the feminization of men, and this is in pretty much every, it's in industrialized cultures. So, you know, we're talking about US, UK, Europe. We see this process occurring. And again, these are industrial countries. Where we don't see this so much is in poorer regions where there's a lack of industry and a lack of processed food consumption, etc. So these man-stealing chemicals, like atrazine is one of the examples, which is a herbicide, mimics estrogen. So it is an estrogen mimic. We have things like glyphosate. We have the bisphenols, the BPAs, and the other BPs, or the phthalates, if you will. These are all estrogen mimicking chemicals. We have a variety of processed food additives and dyes. Preservatives that behave like estrogen. A lot of the compounds that are found in soaps and detergents act like estrogen. So we have this onslaught of toxic estrogen soup. No offense, ladies, but these are chemicals that men are being exposed to from conception through pregnancy. As boys growing, babies growing to boys, as boys growing to teenagers, as teenagers growing to men, we have this feminization that we have seen over the past 40, 50 years. And this is, a number of scientists are talking about this. It's kind of the 10,000-pound elephant in the room that a lot of people are shying away from because of the culture that we're in now around sex and gender. And there's just such a harsh attack on anyone who will call this out. And look, I'm a sexual libertarian. If you're gay, if you're lesbian, I could care less. I love you just as much. I just want the truth to come out. If we are exposing children to this large quantity of known estrogens that we know in animals can cause sex changes in animals, we have to start thinking about how it might be impacting young men as well as young women. But we do, and we are seeing this happen. This is becoming more and more common. And so when we have these types of things, what we're doing is we're having men that are growing up that are more confused, not necessarily because it's 100% that they're born that way, but in large part it can also be playing a role is that they're being exposed to things that if we could take away these exposures, we could improve the quality of their life. We could decrease the confusion around how they're feeling, because again, these chemicals can manipulate the body on a hormonal level. Again, they're endocrine disrupting chemicals, very well researched and very well studied. And there's so many of them now. So man-stealing chemicals are something we want to try to minimize. So this is why we want to eat organic food. This is why we want to try to avoid packaged food items and processed chemical compounds, food dyes, food preservatives, food additives. This is why we want to avoid drinking out of plastics, eating out of plastics, cooking or heating food up in plastics. These are, again, plastics contain these phthalate-based chemicals that mimic estrogen. So again, get this stuff out of your house. Protect your young boys, protect your men, protect your pregnancies by avoiding exposure to these things as much as you possibly can. Men also don't need enabling spouses or parents. We talked earlier about the white lies, right? And this is sometimes we think, oh, it's just a little white lie, it won't hurt. But if the white lies are enabling behaviors that are not manly, that are not conducive to the growth of a man, then they are hurting him. The little things add up. Just like with chemicals, it's the little things cumulatively over time that are adding up. Well, it's the little lies that enabling allow for men to happen. And so, classic example of this is when little lies are spoken that take away, and I shouldn't say take away because, ultimately any man with his right head on his shoulders is not going to be solely dependent upon people around him enabling him. He's going to want to take ownership of his own choices and his own decisions. But it is better if he's got great support around him, where he's got an honesty checkbook, and he can not enable himself either, right? So men need to grow. One of the things that happens emotionally to men who are being enabled, again, whether it's through parents enabling or whether through spouse enabling, or culture or society enabling. There are a lot of ways that men are enabled in society today. I look at the welfare system as a whole. The way it's set up is it's set up to punish people who want to do better and get ahead and go to school and get an education and become self-sufficient. It punishes those people and it keeps them on welfare. This is an enabling behavior that the government has. So it's not, again, it's not always the people that we love. Sometimes it's the bodies that be that stifle the ability for a man to grow because they punish him for growing. Society, unfortunately, has done a lot of that, punishing for improvement or punishing for growth. But men need to grow, and that's part of the conundrum that we're in. When a man isn't growing intellectually, spiritually, physically, when a man stops growing, he starts to mourn. So when he's not growing, he starts mourning. And this is where depression, lack of purpose, and self-isolationism all can set in. And it's what we want to try to avoid because, again, remember, a man needs a purpose. Right? And his family helps him with that. A man needs to feel accomplished. A man needs to feel like he's growing. A man needs emotional support systems and people support systems around him. So this lack of growth leads to kind of this paradoxical change or change of structure of behavior, and that's a problem for men. So enabling is a terrible, terrible thing. So this, again, just reiterating, ladies, always be honest. Always be honest with your husbands, even if it hurts, but do so in a lovingly way so that he can not react with anger and aggression, but can react with hopefully a calm and loving manner back and accept the constructive criticism and grow from it. We also know that men don't need excessive alcohol. This is a big one. There's a lot of debate in the psychology literature and in the addiction literature about how much alcohol is too much alcohol to call somebody an alcoholic. So excessive alcohol, what does that look like? Well, if we're talking about excessive alcohol in a man, if a man is drinking on a nightly basis and he's overweight and he gets irate, then it's excessive, even if it's one drink a night. So alcohol, it's one of those areas where, me personally, I can tell you about myself. I drink a few times a year, but by no means do I drink every night or even once a week or even once a month. This is more of an occasional celebratory time. Now that wasn't always the case. We all have our bouts with alcohol. I drank a lot more in college, probably drank a lot more as a young man, realized and learned lessons from those endeavors that probably wasn't the best thing for my health or the best thing for my career or my advancement in life. But this is, understand, for men, a lot of times when they're here, because of a lack of growth, this becomes a coping mechanism when they're not happy. Because what does the alcohol do? The alcohol shuts down feelings of depression. It shuts down, it numbs what they're feeling. If they feel a lack of purpose, it numbs that feeling. And so they're using it's a self-medication of sorts. And so you have to be careful where that line is. Is a man drinking because he's really self-medicating his issue here, or is he drinking because he likes to have an occasional drink and he's not an excessive drinker? Again, tread lightly here, because some men, you have to go at them with the right mindset and the right conversation, or they're going to become very aggressive and angry at you for trying to take away something that they're using as a medication. Remember, addiction can be a very, very powerful detriment, and so you have to approach this one delicately, but don't not approach it if you feel like it's a problem. Then we have things like sugar, which is pure empty calories, sodas, candies, sugar-loaded, processed, carbohydrate-laden foods that don't give anything other than a dopamine high, right? So sugar is like the instant gratification. It's the instant reward that makes life more bearable for some men who, again, aren't doing this, aren't focused here. So sugar should be one of the first things that you cut. Sugar, in my opinion, should not be part of the diet, on any regular basis at all. Trans fat is another big one for men, especially because of its role with heart disease. And so this is, going back historically, I was kind of picking on women earlier about badgering their husbands to take away the meat because of the risk of heart disease being a myth. I'll remind you that we were told for how many years, almost 50 years, that margarine, which is basically a trans fat, it's hydrogenated vegetable oil. Technically, it's not even vegetable oil; it's hydrogenated canola or corn oil or other processed seed oils where they force hydrogen into the oil using a heavy metal catalyst, and they form something called trans fat. Well, for years we were being told that was healthier than butter, and we were being told to eat that nonsense, right? And so we were driving heart disease up as a result of and this was cardiology advice. This was, the American Heart Association and other groups across the globe were saying, eat this trans fat, it's better for you than meat. And they drove heart disease up in that process. So we now know that, fortunately. So there shouldn't be any doubt. If this is in your diet, you want to get it out. And so the trans fat, again, that's going to be mostly processed seed oils that are put in processed food products. So if you're not eating processed food, if you're cutting out all that nonsense, you're not really going to be exposed to any trans fat. Now understand too that saturated fat, which is what's in meat, so saturated is not the same thing as trans. So what we could say is all trans fat is saturated, but not all saturated fat is trans fat. Trans fat is typically, it's man-made. Again, we pump hydrogen into fat to make it solid at room temperature. Saturated fat is just naturally got hydrogen bonds in it, and so it's solid at room temperature. And so this would be like animal fat is saturated. Now, there's no research studies that show that saturated animal fat increases the risk for heart disease. There's a lot of anecdote, and there's a lot of epidemiological evidence that's been misconstrued and has been used in a misleading way. But there's no real evidence that shows that eating animals increases the risk of heart disease as a result of the saturated fat consumption. It's about the trans fat. So get the trans fat out of the diet. And then again, there's drugs. And then whether it's illicit drugs, one of the things that I've actually abhorred watching is the legalization of marijuana. And not that I'm opposed to somebody using marijuana, but I believe that, I need to tread lightly here, but a lot of people, you have to understand that these new marijuana strains that they're growing are vastly stronger. They're chemically manipulated to be stronger than the classic, hemp marijuana that's grown. So my point is a lot of the new drugs that are coming out that are now legal are anywhere from 2 to 10 times more powerful. We're seeing ER rooms being much busier with with severe psychological issues that occur after the use of marijuana. And so again, it's not something I'm happy about. I think we need to go back to the drawing board and look at this a little bit more intelligently. I think there's a reason that it's called dope. I'm not saying that if you use it on an occasion, that I'm not trying to criminalize you. What I'm really trying to say is where we see people get in trouble, just like with alcohol, is if it becomes a habit, if it becomes a regular part of daily use, then there's a price that's going to happen. There's a price that's going to be paid. And so it's not, again, it's not even just marijuana. There are plenty of other drugs, street drugs, that could also pose a problem for a man